All right, welcome in everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into something a little different today. We're going to be taking a close look at Revell.
Okay.
This was actually a request from one of our listeners to kind of dig in and get a better understanding of Revell as a company,
Mm-hmm.
kind of where they stand today,
Mm-hmm.
and what's the overall perception of the brand within the modeling community.
Yeah.
So the source material that we're going to be using for this deep dive is a YouTube video called Revell Top Odor Flop.
Okay.
Let's talk about it from Michael's Modellbaustube.
Excellent.
So I think most of our listeners are going to be at least somewhat familiar with the Revell brand.
I think so. Yeah. It's one of those names, isn't it? It's kind of like synonymous with model kits. I mean, even if you've never actually built one yourself, you've probably seen those blue boxes in the store.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. So everyone at least kind of has a perception, I think, of Revell.
Yeah.
And our goal today is really to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
See where that comes from. So we want to trace the company's journey, kind of figure out why these opinions on Revell are sometimes so divided, and then try to give you, the listener, a well-rounded perspective on the company itself.
Sounds good to me.
So if we're going to go on that journey, I think we need to start at the beginning.
Okay.
And Revell's story begins in 1942 in New York City.
Oh, wow. Okay. In the Big Apple.
Yeah. Founded by Louis Glazer and Jack Fresco.
Right.
And what's interesting is they didn't actually start out by selling model kits that people could assemble themselves.
Interesting. So they weren't kits.
No, they were actually producing pre-assembled, finished plastic models.
Oh, wow. So they were already built.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So completely different from what we think of today. But then in 1951, they made a pretty big shift.
Okay.
They decided to start producing kits for hobbyists to assemble and paint themselves.
Oh, right. Okay. So that's kind of the big change. That's
Yeah.
what they're known for. Yeah.
And this was kind of the birth of those, famous Revell Highline kits.
Yeah. Yep.
That we all know.
Yeah.
And the source that we're looking at points to this as kind of a major turning point for the company.
I can see why. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. It's an interesting shift to make. I wonder what the sort of reasoning was behind that.
I mean, you have to think. At the time, it was probably quite a big risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it clearly paid off.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so they find some success there in the U.S., and pretty soon they set their sights on expansion.
Okay, yeah. So where did they go?
So in 1956, they established a German branch in Bunde.
Right, yeah, Bunde.
Which I think is a name that, especially if you're in Europe, you're probably pretty familiar with.
Yeah, definitely.
And then they also attempted to make inroads in both the UK and Japan.
Oh, wow.
Japan proved to be a pretty tough market to crack, though.
Really? Wow.
They had some really strong local competition, especially from companies like Hasegawa and Tamiya.
Yeah.
So, those companies were already really well established there. And instead of trying to directly compete with them, Revell actually decided to partner with them.
Oh, wow.
And basically distribute their kits through those existing Japanese brands.
Okay, so that's kind of smart, isn't it?
Yeah.
Work with them.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to see how that played out.
It is.
Okay, so fast forward a couple of decades, and we get to, what many would consider to be the golden age of model building, like the 1970s.
Yeah, right. The 70s.
And our source video actually calls this a huge model building boom.
Yeah.
And during this time, you have, model building magazines popping up everywhere. It just really exploded in popularity.
Yeah, and Revell was kind of at the forefront of that boom.
Absolutely. They were one of the major players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think what kind of, I guess, cultural or social factors might have contributed to that boom, in the 70s. I mean, was it, economic, prosperity? Was it, changes in technology? What was it?
Yeah. I mean, there are probably a lot of things that contributed.
Yeah.
I think one of the big things was probably just that people had more leisure time.
Yeah, that's true.
And, maybe there was also this kind of fascination with, engineering, design. And, I mean, you can't forget about popular culture, too. This was the era of the space race.
Yeah.
Iconic cars and movies.
Absolutely, yeah. Star Wars.
Yeah, I mean, there was just a lot going on that kind of fueled that interest.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, like all booms, it eventually came to an end.
Right.
And according to our source, the late 1970s, so this pretty significant decline in model building.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so what happened? Why did it decline?
And the reason they give is kind of fascinating. They point to the emergence of video game consoles,
Oh, right. Yeah, okay.
which is, I mean, if you think about it, that's kind of a major shift in how people were spending their leisure time.
Yeah,
And it clearly had a pretty big impact on the model building hobby.
makes sense. Yeah, yeah.
So this downturn leads to some changes for Revell as well.
Yeah.
In 1979, a French investor ends up acquiring both the American and the German branches of the company.
Okay.
But that ownership was actually relatively short-lived.
Oh, okay. So what happened next?
In the mid-1980s, a New York-based investor takes over.
Right.
And this is actually a pretty big moment for Revell because this investor had also recently acquired another model kit company, Monogram.
Oh, okay. So that's where we get Revell Monogram.
Exactly. Yeah, so in the U.S., and then eventually in 2006, the German branch became independent.
Okay.
And things seemed to be going pretty well for them for a while.
Yeah.
But then in 2012, they were acquired by Hobbycall,
Right.
which, according to our source, this caused a little bit of anxiety among some enthusiasts.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like their beloved German brand was being, taken over by an American company.
Exactly. Yeah, there were definitely concerns about what that would mean for the future of the brand.
Right. Yeah.
And then just to add another layer to this whole ownership saga, in 2014, a financial investor acquired a 77.2% stake in the company.
Wow. Okay. So it's changing hands quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a lot of back and forth.
It is.
But then in 2018, we get a little bit of maybe a feel-good moment.
Okay.
A Munich-based investor acquired Revell Germany and brought it back under German ownership.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it went full circle.
Yeah.
Back to German.
Yeah, so we kind of came home. But what's interesting is that even through all of these ownership changes, Revell Germany and the American branch, they've maintained a pretty close relationship.
That's interesting. So how does that relationship work?
They've continued to cross-license and distribute each other's model kits.
Oh, okay. So, you might get a kit that was developed in Germany,
Yeah,
but it's being sold under the American Revell brand.
exactly.
Or vice versa.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
So there's still that connection there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of traced the history of Revell from its humble beginnings in New York all the way to the present day.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now we need to kind of address the elephant in the room,
Okay.
which is why are there such divided opinions about Revell in the model building community?
Right.
And our source actually goes into this in quite a bit of detail.
You do, yeah.
And it seems like there are both positive and negative aspects to the brand
Yeah,
that are kind of contributing to this.
that makes sense.
So maybe we should start with the positives.
Yeah.
What are some of the reasons why people continue to choose Revell?
Okay, so let's start with the positives.
Okay.
I think the first one that really stands out is the sheer variety of models they offer.
Yeah.
I mean, their catalog is huge.
That's massive. Yeah.
They have everything from cars and motorcycles to aircraft, helicopters, ships.
Yeah.
They even have science fiction stuff.
Yeah. I mean, they've got kits for pretty much every interest and skill level, too.
They do, and a big part of that comes from, as we touched on earlier, their partnerships and acquisitions.
Right.
So they're not just producing their own designs, they're also bringing in kits from other manufacturers.
Yeah.
They might acquire a smaller company that specializes in a particular type of model and then release those kits under the Revell brand.
Right.
And one really good example of this is the Star Wars models.
Oh, yeah.
So originally, those kits were produced by Bandai, which is, a Japanese company known for really high-quality kits.
Oh.
But Revell acquired the license to produce those kits.
Right.
And so they were able to offer, Star Wars models to a wider audience.
And it wasn't just like a rebranding either.
Right.
I mean, the kits themselves, they were pretty much identical.
Yeah, a lot of times they were.
Which, I mean, I guess it makes sense from a business standpoint.
Yeah.
Why reinvent the wheel
Yeah.
if you already have a really good product?
Especially if it's a popular license,
Yeah,
like Star Wars.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so huge selection. That's definitely a plus.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, I think the other big advantage that Revell has is their availability.
Yeah.
You can find their kits pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, they're not just in hobby shops, are they?
No. I mean, you can find them in department stores, drugstores.
Yeah.
Our source specifically mentions Miller, which is a big chain in Germany.
Right.
I think you can find them online, obviously, too. But the fact that you can just walk into, a regular store and pick up a Revell kit,
Yeah,
it makes the hobby a lot more accessible.
absolutely.
It lowers the barrier to entry.
Yeah, I mean, it's not intimidating,
No,
like having to find a specialty shop.
exactly.
Okay, so we've got variety, we've got availability.
Yeah.
Um, the source also points to their skill level indicator as being a real positive for the brand.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So Revell uses a system to indicate the difficulty level of each kit.
Hmm.
And it's usually based on things like the number of parts
Yeah,
and the complexity of the build.
right.
So it's a really helpful guide for beginners.
Especially, yeah.
Yeah, because you don't want to start off with something that's too challenging.
Right,
You want to kind of ease your way into it.
exactly.
And it's helpful for gift givers, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If you're buying a gift for someone who's just getting into model building, you can look for a kit that has a lower skill level.
Yeah,
And the video actually mentions that Airfix, which is another big model kit company,
yeah.
they use a similar system.
Yeah, it seems like it's a pretty common practice.
Yeah.
And then last but not least on the positives, the video praises Revell's enamel paints.
Oh, yeah. Their paints are really good.
Yeah, they talk about the quality, the pigmentation.
Yeah.
But they do also mention that they're becoming harder to find.
Yeah, that's a shame. Because they are a great product.
Yeah. It seems like Revell is kind of phasing them out in favor of their aquacolor range,
Right.
which is, probably understandable from a business standpoint.
Yeah.
But, there are definitely some modelers out there who are going to miss those enamel paints.
I think so, yeah. Because once you've kind of gotten used to a particular type of paint,
Yeah.
you've developed your techniques
Yeah.
and you know how it works.
You don't have to switch.
Exactly. So, yeah, I can see why that would be a negative for some people.
Yeah. All right, so we've covered a lot of the good stuff about Revell.
Yeah.
But I think now it's time to kind of dive into some of the criticisms that people have about the brand.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about the negative.
Okay. And the first one that the video brings up, and seems to be a major point of contention, is the inconsistent mold quality.
Right.
So apparently, and this is something that I wasn't really aware of, Revell still uses a lot of really old molds.
Yeah.
Some of them dating back 40 years or more.
Wow, that's old, and they
Yeah.
haven't been updated.
No.
Okay.
Which means that the kits that are produced from these molds, they often have fit problems.
Oh, I see.
And they just lack the level of detail that you would expect from a more modern kit.
Right, okay.
And this is something that the video really kind of emphasizes as being a major drawback for a lot of modelers.
I can imagine. I mean, you spend all this time and effort building a model,
Yeah.
and then the parts don't fit together properly.
It's going to be frustrating.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. And then it doesn't look as good as it could
Right.
because the details aren't there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a double whammy.
Yeah, it's disappointing.
Yeah.
And, especially when you compare it to the quality of kits that are being produced by other manufacturers today,
Yeah.
including some smaller companies.
Yeah.
I mean, they're really pushing the boundaries in terms of detail and accuracy.
They are. Yeah.
And so it makes you wonder, why Revell is kind of clinging to these old molds.
It does. I mean, I understand that there are probably cost considerations.
Yeah.
But at some point, you have to think about the customer experience,
Right.
And whether it's worth sacrificing quality for, a slightly lower price point.
Right.
Yeah.
And, it's not just the old molds themselves that are a problem.
Oh.
Apparently, Revell also had this habit of reboxing really old kits,
Oh, wow.
sometimes even kits that are from the 60s and 70s,
Wow.
without actually making any improvements to the molds.
Wow. So they're just putting them in a new box.
Yeah, they're just like, repackaging them
Wow.
and selling them as new.
It's interesting.
The video actually mentions brands like Huber and Bausch as being examples of this.
Right. Okay.
And so, kind of creates this perception that Revell is more focused on quantity over quality.
I can see why people would say that. Yeah. I mean, if they're not investing in new molds
Yeah.
and they're just kind of churning out these old kits.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't give a very good impression.
And it can be misleading too.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you're a new modeler,
Absolutely, yeah.
you see a Revell kit on the shelf,
Yeah.
you don't necessarily know that it's using a 40-year-old mold.
Yeah, exactly. And you might be expecting a certain level of quality
Right.
based on Revell's reputation.
Exactly.
And then you get home and you start building it and
Yeah.
you're like, wait a minute.
This isn't what I was expecting.
This isn't what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on from mold quality, the next criticism that our source brings up is kind of surprising.
Oh, okay. What is it?
They're not happy with the packaging.
The packaging. What's wrong with the packaging?
So Revell has been using these side-opening boxes
Oh, right.
for a really long time.
Yeah.
And the presenter in the video, he's not a fan.
Okay. Why not?
He's concerned about parts getting damaged.
Oh, okay.
Because when you open and close the box, the parts can kind of rub against each other
Right.
and get scratched or broken.
Okay. Yeah, I've had that happen before.
Yeah. And he actually uses his unboxing of a kit called the Kiss Tour truck as an example. He found parts loose in the box
Right.
because they'd come off the sprues.
Yeah.
And so he's advocating for Revell to switch to a more secure type of packaging, like the top opening flap boxes that a lot of other manufacturers use.
Right. Yeah, those are better.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty reasonable request.
It does. I mean, it's not a major thing,
Right.
but it can be really annoying if you damage a part.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially if it's like a small, delicate part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think they should switch to the top opening boxes.
Yeah. Okay, and then the final criticism that the video brings up has to do with the instruction manuals.
Okay, the instructions.
Yeah. Now, they do acknowledge that the quality of the manuals themselves has improved.
Okay.
They're printed in color now
Right.
on thicker paper, which is good.
Yeah.
But the problem is with the way that the paint colors are called out in the instructions.
Oh, okay.
So instead of just listing the color, name, or the number, they use a letter code.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And apparently this code, it doesn't always correspond to the same color across different Revell kits.
Oh, that's confusing.
Yeah, it's really confusing.
So you might have a letter code that represents one color in one kit
Yeah.
and then a completely different color in another kit.
Yeah.
Okay, that's not very helpful.
It makes it really difficult to know what paint to use.
Yeah.
And, especially if you're a beginner,
Yeah,
it can be really frustrating.
it can be.
So, yeah, it seems like they need to simplify that system,
Definitely.
make it more user-friendly.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, so those are some of the main criticisms that people have about Revell.
Right.
So we've kind of looked at both sides of the coin now,
We have.
the good and the bad.
Yeah.
What's your overall takeaway from all of this?
Well, I think it's clear that Revell is a complex company
Yeah.
with a long and interesting history.
Yeah.
They have a lot of strengths.
Thanks,
Their selection is amazing.
Yeah.
They're widely available. Their skill level indicators are a really nice touch.
Yeah.
And their paints are really good.
Yeah.
But they also have some weaknesses.
Definitely.
The inconsistent mold quality is a big issue.
Yeah.
Their packaging could be better, and their instruction manuals could be more user-friendly.
Absolutely.
So it's not a simple case of, Revell is great or Revell is terrible.
Right.
It's more nuanced than that.
It is, yeah.
I think it really depends on what you're looking for in a model kit
Yeah.
and what your priorities are.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Revell, I think it's safe to say that our initial question has been answered.
It has. Yeah, we've definitely gotten a much more well-rounded perspective on the company.
Yeah, it's not a simple yes or no.
No.
It's a lot more complicated than that.
Definitely.
But I think that's what makes it so interesting, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So I guess, the big question now is, where does Revell go from here?
Yeah,
They've clearly had a lot of success,
they have.
but they've also faced some challenges.
Yeah.
So how do they adapt to the ever-changing landscape of the model building hobby?
That's a good question.
Are they going to continue to rely on those old molds?
Yeah.
Or are they going to start investing in new technology?
Yeah.
Are they going to address some of those criticisms about their packaging and their instructions? It's going to be interesting to see what they do.
It will be.
So I guess, for you, the listener, I think the takeaway here is that Revell is a company with a lot of potential, but they also have some areas where they can improve.
Absolutely.
So, next time you see that Revell logo, maybe take a moment to consider everything that we've talked about today.
Yeah.
And, form your own opinion.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Revell.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We'll see you next time.